Mark, I thought it was very encouraging you started off by trying to get us to focus on the positives rather than the negatives. And I think that sometimes we can be a bit down on ourselves as a nation. The dynamics for the positives, particularly those last 2 decades of growth, and the fact that we haven't been through the recession cycles that many of our competitors have, I think brings with it both a lot of good things, but maybe a few bad things as well, that we maybe are a little bit complacent about where we are. One of the main points that I found very interesting was this question about how do you break the chicken and egg cycle around population growth and infrastructure? Because you often get argument about, well, we can't afford to have more people because the infrastructure we have won't support it, but population growth is clearly a great way to actually drive economic growth, and clearly as a country we can support more population. How do you think in terms of those issues about actually thinking about population policy and planning, that where we see that there is reluctance to take long-term views around infrastructure, that we can break that cycle and get our political leaders to adopt and recognise the need for that, because unless we have that, we are likely to constrain ourselves doubly by not being able to break the existing lagging infrastructure quality. And we need to bring the two things together. So maybe you could elaborate a bit more on that.
I think the population challenge we face is a good one, and as I said, there'd be many nations from Japan through to France who'd like to have a population growth issue, and we've got that because people want to live here, they want to work here, and we should enjoy that reality. Can we face up to it? I think we can. We've dealt with population growth which is larger than this in the past, particularly during the 50s, and we planned for it well. And state governments in particular had to face the lion's share of that challenge. The scale of the growth and also the nature of the cost of the projects needed, that needs to be equal federal partnership in this now, as well as states and territories. The spread of the growth is something that is very much on our mind. If you look at that chart that I put up of cities growing, so there's 4 cities that effectively double or more in size: Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and Perth. But in 50 years, Melbourne is bigger than Sydney and Perth is bigger than Brisbane. And these are projections based on all of the estimates that you can have of likely migration, natural birth rates, availability of housing in particular, which is a key criteria. And Hobart and Adelaide and Darwin grow less than you would want as a nation. And I think it's worthwhile us having a national debate about the fact that, do we want to sit around in 50 years and say, well, I wondered if we could influence that? Because I think we should be doing that now as a matter of public policy discussion. Hobart and Adelaide are brilliant cities with great opportunities, but will have the population growth lower than is desirable as far as those cities and those state governments involved are concerned, and we should facilitate growth in those cities. On top of that, Darwin does grow very substantially but off a low base, and Canberra in a similar context. Now we need to ensure that the growth options of those cities can be fulfilled, and it would also have the upside benefit of easing some of the growth pressures in the rest of the nation. Finally, in this context, we shouldn't be blinded by only looking at cities. We put as much emphasis in our plan on regions like the Pilbara, which technically have a very low population base, say around 50,000 in one area, but that doesn't mean you should treat it as that. You need to treat it as the economic powerhouse as it is. So it's a multifaceted approach, but I highlight that graph on population growth because to me that requires a lot of discussion so that we can just get all the best and most positive ways of ensuring we get the benefits of it.
Just down the front here, and just while the microphone's coming, I think I think the importance of Darwin shouldn't be overlooked from a defence perspective. I think our whole position in the Asia Pacific doesn't make a lot of sense for all the economic development to be at the bottom of the country. So down here, please.
Thank you. Flavio Menezes from UQ, University of Queensland. There's a sense today that we're kind of at cusp of a technological revolution, right? That will potentially have an impact on the type of infrastructure that we'll need in 20, 30, or 40, or 50 years' time. And two examples come to mind: electricity batteries, so it might be go off the grid, and you have to think about what happens to the billions and billions of dollars that we have, invested in electricity distribution. And the second one is driverless cars. So I'm just curious of what's the thinking within Infrastructure Australia. You're kind of setting up these long-term plans. How do you feel technology?
Yeah, good question, because the world's shifting, isn't it? And battery storage is sort of the most recent dramatic example of change in infrastructure, and if that storage keeps developing in the way that is anticipated, then you will alter the energy industry in this country and elsewhere for the better. And I welcome it. In transport, certainly driverless cars, also electric cars probably powered by a battery that's stored at the home is a sea change. It means that you'll get far greater utilisation out of existing networks and far safer use of existing networks, and perhaps the option of not owning a vehicle at all but sharing it in a manner that suits you. To the extent that we're trying to foresee the future, I was slightly relieved by the fact that we were asked to look out 15 years rather than 50, because it would be a far more difficult prospect. But what we have to do is embrace the opportunity for using new technology, and we very much signal that in our report. The debate about infrastructure is usually about new projects. We talk a lot about resilience and maintenance of existing assets, because it is equally as important as new projects. But also it's important to realise that when these cities are as large as they are, the majority of the infrastructure that they'll be using in 50 years' time or 15 years' time is already built. And it's a question of whether we use that existing infrastructure better. That's where we need to look to technology. I go to work most mornings on a train. I live in Melbourne. The train is outstanding. It was built in, the line was built in 1890. It was electrified in about 1920, and hasn't had a hell of a lot spent on it since. What it meant was that it was very well developed and built. But it also means that that rail line is probably going to be the main corridor, and now we can look at investment in it, which increases its efficiency, particularly in terms of signalling, dare I say ticketing, and gets us into the 21st century on public transport that often hasn't had the maintenance budget that it deserves. The report factors all this in because it's important that we embrace the new technology that'll better use existing assets.
Thanks. Down the back.
Mr. Chair, I'm the principal of Keith Redenbach Legal, and I noticed that in the report, talking obviously about economic and political significant developments, the mention of, I think, a major development in the last 12 or so months was the tearing up of the East-West Link contract in your home state. The question is, how, as an industry, can that sort of, some would say, vandalism be stopped, prevented, mitigated, or, I guess, never repeated?
Yeah, thanks. I don't think there are any winners out of that. The value of having a long-term observable pipeline of infrastructure projects is very clear. If we can create, as we've done through this process of consultation with every state and territory government, every peak body from Engineers Australia and the architects through to the local government association, the Australian Rail Association, the Australian Water Association. If you can create a consensus list of large long-term projects that Australia needs over 15 years, then you reduce the risk of uncertainty and paralysing debate over what projects you should move on. It is in all of our interests that we try and have a common path on where we will take infrastructure with a shared mission, and I think there's an enhanced chance of that occurring. The bipartisan support that has been given to the infrastructure priority list is the beginnings of that. We're not claiming the credit for it. We harness together the lists of good thinking people, and I think we need that, and then you get a list that people start to focus on. The likelihood, therefore, of it not being followed is very low. That being said, dynamism should be allowed, new ideas, but not stage right surprises.
Steve?
Thank you, Chairman. Stephen Martin from CEDA. Mark, I wanted to go to your issue around funding infrastructure and the concept of recycling proceeds from asset sales.
Yep.
Many of the state governments, of course, have just about sold off everything, including their state parliament houses. And as a consequence, selling what's left to then fund some of this infrastructure need in the future may not necessarily be as easy as it sounds. But I want to take you to your graph about the 4 major cities and the population growth that's going to occur there. Has Infrastructure Australia given any thought to putting on the very large table that our Prime Minister has spoken about the concept of congestion charging or congestion taxes within the major cities as one way of contributing to the funding, if you like, of mass transit systems that may in fact be needed to take the place of cars coming to central cities?
Yeah, we certainly have, and we want to see a good public discussion and a lot more research on the practical implementation of a user pay system for motor vehicle usage on our roads, but only if it's based on 2 preconditions: the abolition of existing charges and taxes, including all taxes on petrol, and the hypothecation of all the revenue back into infrastructure. You will carry off reform if consumers believe you and see the benefit. You won't carry off reform on transport pricing or taxation change if it's perceived, rightly or wrongly, that the money's just gone into general revenue somewhere. It's lost. Currently, typical drivers are paying between, say, $800 and $1,200 a year on fuel charges. They don't see the tax, but they're paying it every time they purchase petrol. And that revenue is not hypothecated towards infrastructure, and indeed wouldn't anyway, because it's a declining revenue. It's a tax that's going to be reviewed because it's completely dysfunctional. People are quite correctly purchasing less petrol if they can in more fuel-efficient cars, or ones that are going to be electric, where they won't be paying any tax, even though they're still using the road. This is an illogical current system for collecting tax revenue. We want it to be reviewed and revised. So instead of London-style congestion charging, which is unique to London, and London is unique in itself, or city-states like Singapore, we should look to be having a market in transport, and as much as we move to a market in energy over a period of 20 years, and a proper market in telecommunications over 20 years. So the 4 sectors, 2 of them are almost completely reformed compared to what they were in the 1970s and 80s, energy and telecommunications. Water is partially reformed, but needs an independent price regulator and all of the virtues that come from disconnecting the owner of the asset from being its own price regulator. So a proper market where you can get competition. and then you'll get diversity and you'll get improvements in efficiency. Transport is an unreformed market. It's got all the characteristics of the 1890s. It's just completely unreformed. I tell a story, my daughters, when they were looking to get mobile phones, they didn't come to me. I was a minister at the time. They didn't come to me and say, I'm going to write a letter to my local MP so that I can get a mobile phone. That's not the way you do. They just went out into a highly competitive market and had an abundance of choice. And every year that they went to get a mobile phone, it was cheaper than the previous year. That's what a market was. But telecommunications, in 20 years ago, was 100% government owned and no choice. You can change infrastructure markets. Transport, though, I want to improve the local transport service as far as my daughter's concerned. You do write to your local MP and you hope you can scratch together the funds. The problem with that is there's not enough money around. Because unlike the 1890s when my railway line was built, very well, the focus was on spending on infrastructure because there was proportionately far less spent on social welfare and pensions. And these are legitimate alternative uses for the public funds. And therefore, we're in a debate now where you can't just spend as much as you used to spend on infrastructure. And if people sort of wonder in their minds, why is it we're so far behind? It's because there's other uses for that money. And the other uses often win, and often they win legitimately. Therefore, the way to solve transport is to get a market in place. But it involves getting rid of the current system. And we're saying in our report that over the next 10 years, that should be the objective. Everyone's written on this in the past, the Henry Review, the Productivity Commission. There's heated agreement amongst the thinkers. What we've got to do is just to get past the reluctance to be the first to start the reform process.
Thanks. Just one last question from the front here.
Yeah. Hi, Mike. Marika Kalfas from NSW Ports. Thank you for your address and for a comprehensive and well-considered plan. I liked your commentary and what's in the plan around infrastructure resilience and protection. And my question to you is really, from an existing infrastructure, and you talked about better utilisation of existing assets, one of the key impediments, or some of the key impediments to better utilisation and maximising capability of existing infrastructure, such as ports and rail facilities, has to do with things that happen in the catchment around it, in particular urban encroachment that creates limitations on what you can do on the infrastructure and being able to maximise your capabilities through that infrastructure. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the role of either Infrastructure Australia or federally, what can be done to assist in protecting some of the key infrastructure and nationally significant infrastructure from those competing pressures that limit its capabilities in the longer term.
Yeah, you've politely expressed a difficult issue, and the Sydney Airport here would be a good example of a outstanding asset by world standards, a highly convenient airport which doesn't go through a month in the last 20 years where there isn't a discussion about reducing its role because of neighbouring noise issues which are part of a legitimate debate. And we try and just tease out this issue. There's no right or wrong in these debates about people who are neighbours to a large asset or who are on the route of a large asset. We're wanting to do a proper supply chain study because you might have an efficient port or an efficient airport, and you might have an improved road connection to a factory, but if the local council has put, because of legitimate local pressure, a time limit on when the trucks are allowed to enter the factory, then it doesn't matter that the best time to use a road is 2 a.m. in the morning, which it is, and the best time to get the product out of the port is 1:30 a.m. in the morning if the truck isn't able to deliver at 2:30 a.m. in the morning. Now, I think there's completely legitimate arguments on both sides of this, but it's better to have the debate openly rather than regret it and just leave it to sort of trench warfare. And you do that by talking about the productivity benefit, and you do that by dealing with the issues of amenity, noise, lighting, the trucks that beep when they back. These are real issues for a neighbour, whereas for a trucking company they're just a safety thing. So we're trying to call out this debate by saying let's talk about curfews, for example. Let's talk about the efficient use of infrastructure. And my answer to people who are worried about noise and light from some infrastructure assets is to say that's fair enough. Let's put the onus on the owner to see how we can absolutely improve the things you're worried about with that asset. And if you do that, you usually get a solution. I'm a lawyer, but I'm a great believer in engineers being able to solve virtually anything. I seriously believe they can, as long as you give them the right to be engaged with a productive outcome.
Okay, thanks very much. We need to wrap up the session now. It's my last task to thank Mark Birrell on behalf of you all. It's been a very, very interesting presentation and discussion this morning. I think that one of the challenges for us all is to make sure going forward that the national priorities that flow out of this process are owned and advocated by all of us. I think with the greatest of respect to, I can see at least 3, maybe 4 ex-politicians in the audience, what we really need to do is that the priorities and the projects are owned by all of us, advocated by us, and that we put the appropriate pressure on making sure that those priorities are delivered over time and move away from the ownership projects and the divisiveness around projects as much as is possible, notwithstanding the issues that Mark was just speaking about, that there will always be tensions around projects. What we need to do is take the bigger picture and get as many people as we can on the bus, or even better in the city on the ferry, to ensure that there is the alignment moving forward. And I think if we all can advocate above and beyond our self-interest, it's in all of our interests. So please join with me in thanking Mark this morning, and we have a small token of our appreciation. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.